Hello and welcome to Breaking Culture Live. My name is Sean Johnson Andrews, and I'm your host. I'm the past president of the Cultural Studies Association, and I'm broadcasting in Chicago. Thanks for joining us in this experiment in scholarly communication. Every Wednesday, or almost every Wednesday, we speak with academics and activists, breaking down the breaking news, discussing their work, and how it helps us to understand a contemporary event or emerging trend, and to intervene in making the world a better place. Today's guest and the organization he works for is at the forefront of helping communities organize against authoritarianism. Zachary Mueller is senior strategist at States at the Core, where he works with state, local, and community groups across the country who are facing everything from white nationalist rallies to school board takeovers to political violence. He's an expert in communications and narrative work that confronts authoritarian movements. And some of his upcoming trainings focus on training activists to meld local organizing with local stories. Prior to joining STAC, Zachary worked for years combating anti-immigrant forces at the national level, following years as a union organizer focused on organizing low-wage workers. Thanks so much for taking the time to chat today, Zach.
Yeah, glad to be here. Thanks for the invite.
You bet. Before we get started, I wonder if you can introduce the organization you work for. So what is States at the Core, and what have they been doing over the past 18 months and maybe even before that? What is States at the Core?
Yeah, so States of the Core is a newer organization, but what our goal and mission and charge is to work with state, local, community groups to confront what we often call like authoritarian incursions. That is to work with folks on the ground to deal with different authoritarian movements that have shown up that are attacking communities. Often groups on the ground in communities are volunteer run or understaffed and overworked in lots of different ways, fighting good fights for public goods, for expanding, good public education or access to, safe and welcoming communities. And they may not have the resources or capacities to take on these authoritarian movements and threats. So we work with different organizations from all over the country, really to help think about how can we be supportive to really combat authoritarian efforts that limit the democracy, freedoms, and rights of all Americans. So working with folks to expand democracy, think about how we can create safe and welcoming communities all over the country.
And as I understand it, you've done this for thousands of folks across the country over the past 18 months. So that you've been very busy.
Yeah. We work with some different groups and formations, different entities in deep ways on the ground, and then we also offer lots of national trainings for folks to get and learn skills about how they can show up into their communities, organize neighbor to neighbor, to either respond to any kind of authoritarian efforts in their communities. Because what we know is that what we are up against is an authoritarian movement, which means that it's not about a person or like a single person or an administration or one organization. Movements are complex phenomenon of lots of local forces, national forces, talking, competing, sometimes collaborating with one another, and lots of the authoritarian efforts and advances to attack our democracy show up in real localized, specific ways in different communities. And as we know, each community is a little bit unique, right? They've got their own challenges, but their own benefits. And so a lot of what our national trainings are about how helping regular, everyday Americans think about how do I work and organize with my neighbor, talk to my neighbor about building and strengthening this kind of like democratic muscle of Democrat with a small d, of like how do we actually participate in kind of the day-to-day work of democracy, of making sure that we are protecting against authoritarian threats, supporting and protecting our neighbors in our neighborhoods, or how these different ways that they show up.
Well, this past week, we've seen ICE resuming some of its more publicly violent tactics. We had two people have been killed by ICE agents, one in Houston, Texas, and another in Biddleford, Maine, as I know you know. And the
Mhm.
immediate reaction from DHS was to try to paint them as criminals posing a threat. And in the weeks before this, we've seen the FBI arrest activists in Ohio and Minnesota. You've been
Mhm.
writing about this on States at the Core, ostensibly because they were also engaged in criminal activity. So what do you see going on there, and how does this intersect with the work you're doing at States at the Core?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we can see, right, is that unfortunately and tragically, there is a clear pattern of DHS lying about these violent instances, and especially about violence instances of which that our neighbors are dead as a result of ICE agents. And we know that this pattern exists because they've repeatedly continued to be proven liars on the facts of the case when these instances occur. They want to get into a debate and a challenge about whether or not there was some kind of justified use of violent, deadly force against our neighbors. But I think we all need to take their statements, unfortunately, with a serious grain of salt about whether or not that the folks that they're engaging with are threats to our communities. Because what we know is from the work from neighbors to neighbors, from documented instances, from what we've been seeing, is that ICE is going after our neighbors, mothers, fathers, people in our community, rounding them up in this effort to redefine who gets to be an American based upon an idea of, the color of your skin, the accent you speak with, or where you might have been born. And I think it is really important for us to think about in this moment that there is a policy, an agenda that is created that is emphasizing and is cultivating and encouraging this sort of violent response. When leaders in public positions of power, when normalize the rhetoric of invasions, to talk about our neighbors as somehow an invading force for years, talk about them in dehumanizing ways, and then spend billions of dollars to put a government agency to aggressively go into communities and round folks up, not necessarily based on any kind of priorities, but as a numerical basis to say, we want to see numbers here. Well, then what you're doing is you're creating the conditions of which that this violence will occur. And what we have seen, even in these last two most recent shootings by ICE, was that ICE in both situations was not even interacting with either of these men because of some list or who they were going after on a warrant. Is that they are looking for other people.
No criminal convictions at all, or any. They weren't even the person they were looking for, right?
Not even the person that they were looking for. So why? So why is ICE actually engaging in aggressively pulling over people in these stops? And I think it's helpful for us to think about even like what that looks like, right? Imagine that you're going to work in the morning and all of a sudden there is cars all around you, men who are often masked, very unclear about what kind of agency or if any that they're with, yelling, sometimes guns already drawn in situations. There is like anybody would freak out in that moment, right? Like there's just a panic moment of which that occurs. And they're creating these in this moment and creating those kinds of conditions of which that what we have seen is that these ICE officers then have been told that they are engaging with a community that are in a dehumanizing way, that this is somehow a war footing about an invasion.
Yeah.
And they are stopping folks, clearly not because of a warrant, but because of how they look or how they sound, and engaging inside of an aggressive ability. And in these two very tragic instances, are causing the lives of two fathers. And now their children are going to grow up without a dad because of a policy that was a set of choices that were made that says that this is the kind of conditions that we're putting in. And this is happening with thousands of people all across the country on a daily basis, and has been happening with a ramp up of this kind of activity. And I think if it continues, we're going to unfortunately see more deaths at the hands of ICE because they're creating the conditions of which that this is going to continue to happen. Why? Not because of like some kind of need or necessary piece to keep our community safe, because doing this in our neighborhoods, right, is bringing the chaos and violence.
Sure.
But because of a commitment by a authoritarian movement that is animating this administration, that wants to redefine who is a real American, who wants to erode our democracy and our rights and our freedoms. And I think that is why we are seeing this sort of violence, this deadly violence in our communities.
Well, and this kind of leads me to think about there's a place where you've focused a lot on the where this blueprint, where we can see this blueprint in its totality, right?
Mhm.
Which is Tennessee, and I confess I hadn't paid that much attention to what's going on in Memphis or Tennessee as a whole since Stephen Miller had his little fascist coming out party there.
Mhm.
Um, but in some of your recent reporting, you've shined a spotlight on what's going on there, especially in Memphis, calling it a site of a democracy heist and a second redemption. So why should
Mhm.
we be paying attention to what's going on there in Memphis?
Yeah, I think however you think about Stephen Miller, I think, you know, he is a smart strategist. And if Stephen Miller thinks that Tennessee is important, the folks who believe in democracy, who are against white nationalism, who are thinking about how do we create a the fulfill that kind of promise of American democracy. If for those folks who think about those things and care about them, we also need to pay attention to Tennessee, because if Stephen Miller's paying attention to
Right.
Tennessee, we've got to pay attention to Tennessee, because there's something that's important that's happening there. Because I think what Stephen Miller is trying to do there, and others, he's not alone. There's a movement that is around in Tennessee, and that is why Stephen Miller is focusing on it, because there is different movement elements, both at the like in the institutional powers of the state of Tennessee, like in elected office, and on the ground in different ways of more movement forces there, to be able to experiment, to use Tennessee as a super lab to advance their authoritarian agenda.
Sure.
Advance an authoritarian agenda that is animated by white nationalist ideas. What do I mean by that? Right. Well, you mentioned very briefly that they wanted to think about the state legislature to advance a set of immigration, quote unquote, immigration related policies that were really about targeting, not only just targeting immigrant communities in the state, for removing all services, for aggressive ability to weaponize all of the local police into a massive show me your papers version. So one of the bills, right, is about the 287G agreements. What this really means is to take all of local police and turn them into a show me your papers force across the state. So that
Which
every
is what you point out. They've done this. I mean, for those of you who aren't watching or who haven't been paying attention, they did this first in Memphis, right? This is kind of where
Mhm.
you start the trajectory there. That's why Stephen Miller sort of showed up there after they were in Chicago and Minneapolis and Washington D.C. and Los Angeles. They came to Memphis and they were sort of welcomed there. And this was part of that regime there, where basically they had complete collaboration with the state,
complete.
local, and community police.
Yeah, and I think this is part of like the expansion of the 287G agreement, or these kind of show me your papers versions, right? So they're going to do that across the state. And so that every interaction, every traffic stop now is like, are you a citizen? Right? That kind of escalation. And then in Memphis, very specifically, it is this expansion of this task force model that is a more of a permanent condition, of which that the National Guard have been and continue to be deployed in Memphis as an occupying force inside of Memphis, with the local state National Guard, plus the local police, plus federal agents who are um, in a position of which that they are policing every day in an aggressive and forceful way that is taking that community, which is the largest majority Black city in the entirety of the United States. Like, it's not surprising that the largest Black city in the country is the locus and focus of the
Mhm.
most aggressive points of this authoritarian effort. And so, what they're doing in Memphis too is expanding the reach. That it is not even just a narrative framework of a set of lies that we should be afraid about the criminality of immigrants. But they're doing criminality much broader to attack
Sure.
Black and brown folks in a much more aggressive way. That this isn't just about how we think about immigrant neighbors, but this is a
Right.
broader set about immigrants. And so I think I'd often talk about Tennessee and Memphis as a window into the future of what authoritarian entrenchment starts to look like even more. Because that kind of expansion of taking what is a city in a deeply red state that have authoritarian efforts have controlled the power to lock down an entire city in a police state that is taking the residents of the city based upon the color of their skin or the accent they speak with and presuming that they don't belong or that they are acting in criminal activity. And even in between these two ICE deaths that we have seen, the task force in Memphis killed 2 people in that same week period. That
Really?
is what's happening here. There's already been 4 deaths by the task force, which includes the National Guard, inside of Memphis in that one city. And they've been there since September. And so if we want to talk about like surges and the occupation of a city, like that is why I think it is really important for us to focus in on Memphis and think about what is happening there. Because if we don't pay attention to what's happening in Memphis, if we don't push back on what's happening in Memphis, then every city that is like, a quote unquote blue city in a red state might be subject to the same sort of expansive task force that Memphis is currently under. And I think we need to think about the kind of long standing implications for the advancement of authoritarian regimes and powers and movements when there is an effort that can use National Guard, federal enforcement, plus local police as an occupying force to lock down different parts of communities and cities, particularly in places where non-white communities are concentrated, more progressive folks are concentrated, folks that want to stand up to authoritarian efforts are concentrated in different parts, really throughout most of the Midwest, the Rust Belt, the Upper South, and the South itself are really areas of concern that Memphis might be a progenitor of what can come if we don't organize to name it and to stop it.
Well, and I think a really important sort of follow up to that that you talk about is that then the next stage of this was the redistricting, right?
Mhm.
That after the judgment that allowed the sort of like shredded the Voting Rights Act in April, one of the first things that Tennessee did was to effectively take away the ability of the Black citizens of Memphis to have any representation at all. So this kind of represents this whole continuum of authoritarian attacks. We see the police intimidating on on people on the street, especially immigrants and people of color, and now they're being disenfranchising those very same people, making it impossible. And I think, as you point out, for them to use their vote to counter
Mhm.
these intimidation tactics and have any representation at all. So that makes it even more sort of encapsulation of the problem we're looking at.
No, I think that's 100% right. Right. So it is like thinking about the policing of the community. It's thinking about stripping the access to the franchise and the decision making power of working people. Because like, in 72 hours after that Supreme Court case, like uh, Tennessee was already moving to strip and redraw maps with scientific precision to limit the power of working people to be able to choose their representatives, to be able to push back. Now, democracy isn't dead in Tennessee, right? There is a long standing effort to organize in those communities. And I don't want to
Sure.
talk about like Memphis or Tennessee as that the ship has sailed there. There is real organizing efforts. And I think there's a real opportunity here in this moment as authoritarians advance. When you advance, there's an opportunity to catch them out ahead of their skis. And I think this is why Tennessee is so important here in this particular moment, that there is a moment of which that they are trying to make this advance and then concretize it. Because if they are allowed to get away with the occupation in Memphis through the task force, if they are allowed to get away with the redistricting, and there's not any political consequences that they are going to suffer, right? That is a sense of emboldenment and entrenchment. And I think we're in this unique moment of, yes, hyper parallel, like a peril, but also with a lot of opportunity to be able to say that the majority of Tennesseans, the majority of this country, actually don't want authoritarianism. What we do want is actually an expansion of democracy. We want, like, working people want to be able to have more say of their own over their own lives. And that's what I think democracy is, right? And I think that's what's happening in Tennessee, is a stripping and trying to take away the efforts of different communities. And again, not surprisingly, metered out in the most aggressive way possible on Black communities very specifically. And I think that is an important piece that we can't ignore in what's happening in Tennessee and across the country.
Yeah, I think in a post you mentioned Tennessee as is where the Ku Klux Klan started, right? But this is also where John Lewis starts, right? This is where John Lewis and the sort of lunch counter sit-ins begin, or at least they're that's where they kind of really gain steam there. So there's a long tradition here of both sides of that struggle.
Yeah. And I think this has been a long struggle, right? Like, this has been the American struggle between struggling for a expanded version of democracy and citizenship and an authoritarian struggle to reduce it, right? I think when I talk about there being a second redemption happening in Tennessee, it is a calling to this idea and the naming of another authoritarian movement that was built out of violent white supremacy in the South, primarily after the Civil War. So after the Civil War, we can think about
this redemption. This is a concept you talk about. That the redemption is after Reconstruction. Yes,
so after Reconstruction. So after the Civil War, there's a massive expansion on, like, public education, about democracy. It is about including a massive expansion of citizenship, meaning that our Black neighbors who were enslaved are now enfranchised as citizens, right? That's a massive expansion of citizenship, a massive expansion of democracy, right? And we see the power of that expansion of democracy and citizenship, and in lots of different ways. But there is another movement, an authoritarian movement, that is built partly from the Ku Klux Klan, lots of other pieces of the movement that violently attack that expansion of democracy, that expansion of citizenship, that violently force out that sort of democratic expansion into authoritarian contraction. That is like what scholars talk about as the redemption. And I think we are in something very similar, in that the authoritarian movement that we are currently confronted with has been building since 1965, in the way that folks in this movement who write the books and et cetera on the authoritarian movement will point to 1965 and around the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and importantly, the Immigration Act of 1965 as some sort of bureaucratic revolution that changed the face of the country. Because again, this was after, like, at the height of the Civil Rights Movement. This was an expansion of democracy and citizenship. And what we are seeing now is a movement of a second redemption version, which is trying to violently use white nationalist, white supremacist ideas to animate an authoritarian movement, to contract democracy, to contract citizenship. Not just citizenship as it means for our neighbors who, like, are immigrants, but contract citizenship about what it means and what rights and values and freedoms that we have. That means the access to bodily autonomy, contracting that level of citizenship, the access to the ballot box for all of us, right? A contraction of citizenship, a gutting of public education. That is a contraction of citizenship, about like what we actually get in value by being a part of this nation. And we are currently seeing a version of that. And Tennessee is kind of at the forefront of that kind of redemption piece, as it has been in the past. But it, as you mentioned, right, the movements of democracy that have pushed back on those authoritarian efforts, those authoritarian movements, have also come where those attacks have been the sharpest in the South, in Tennessee, and others.
Yeah, as you were talking, and one of the other features of this authoritarian push that I've been following is the criminalization of transgender care and trans existence overall,
Mhm,
and the recent Supreme Court ruling in Skirmetti allowing states to criminalize this care came out of Tennessee as well.
mhm.
And I know people are in Chicago. I know people here who fled the state in order to keep themselves and their children safe. You mentioned this a little in your reporting, and I also know that you're in Kansas right now, so that's another place where there's been a lot of attacks on trans folks, people's licenses being revoked,
Mhm.
and so I wonder if this is something you see as part of that larger authoritarian agenda,
Yeah, I
and
mean, this is why
how.
we think about like, and we talk about often that we're up against an authoritarian movement. And I think the movement part is really important for folks to understand, which is that the movement operates on many different fronts, right? One, it is thinking about kind of mass deportation machine. Another is like attacking voting rights as a different front. But the other is to attack LGBT, gender issues like restriction of women, right there, and there are several other moments of different fronts of attack, which is about constricting rights and freedoms, which is about redefining who gets to be a quote unquote real American. And I think it's helpful for us to think about that the actually the fight to um, attack our trans neighbors is connected to the fight to attack our immigrant neighbors. In the same way that this authoritarian movement wants to create an extremely narrow version of what it means to quote be a real American, and how many of the of us that they want to say are un-American because of what we believe, because of like who we love, or because of what we look like. And I think that is really important for us to think about how these things are connected, because if we understand an authoritarian movement as such, we start to see that their version of who has rights, who gets to be protected, who gets listened to is extremely narrow based upon the reflection of what a set of them view in the mirror, of like what they think a family should look like and act like and believe. And I think so many Americans, most Americans, by a vast, vast majority, don't fit that definition of what it means to be an American, of what it means to have a family. And I think it is really important for us to see that these things are connected, and that the movement of our ability to organize neighbor to neighbor in community defense organizations or different kind of formations to practice and fight and build that kind of expanded version of democracy, that is important to protecting all of our different types of families, of how we show up for each other in this moment.
Well, and I'm glad you kind of move into that direction because being here in Chicago, I've seen how effective those rapid response networks were, even if it was exhausting and often dispiriting, just sort of watching a random neighbor get taken. Yes, we might have
Mhm,
prevented others from getting taken that day, but they still got someone, and we don't know
mhm.
what happened, and that's very dispiriting. And it seems like the same thing happened in Minneapolis. They were ultimately effective in kind of raising national awareness and beating back those ICE incursions. So, how does states in the core, or does states in the core help people organize at that level? Is this part of what you do?
Yeah, so we've actually got a training tonight. We've got a training on Friday, and the training on Friday is really thinking about how do we do more of the Ice Watch. So if you've not been trained on Ice Watch, really what that is a non-confrontational, non-violent, non-interference tactic that of what we have seen work, which is to use and turn our cell phones into vehicles of accountability. And I think we think about Ice Watch as a tactic that we do in community. It's not just a recording of a video, right? But it is these community defense networks, you might call them rapid response networks, but it is a networks of neighbors thinking about how are we keeping an eye on our community about safety and protection from these ICE agents who would come into our communities and grab up our neighbors. And so ICE Watch is a tactic that we do to be able to document that activity, to then turn around and support our neighbors who face ICE-induced crises, but also think about recruiting more of our neighbors into the effort that says that this policy is not the policy that we want.
Right.
This is not the policy that keeps us safe. So it is thinking about how are we organizing together to do that sort of work to try to protect each other. And as you said, like, it's never going to be enough. Like, we're not going to be able to protect every single person. And that's really, really hard. But if we don't stand up, if we don't organize neighbor to neighbor, if we don't do this sort of documentation, then this happens in a quiet vacuum. And it will continue to happen and happen and happen. Right? Like, we're not going to be able to stop it all by ourselves. But this is why this kind of connection between neighbors, talking to neighbors, building them out, getting connected in these networks are really important to both shine a light on what is happening in our communities and then tell the story about what's happening, to be able to show that this is not what we want and we are going to demand something better and something different. And so
I think
we
one of
train
the things
folks.
that's been
Yeah.
one of the things that's been shocking is after they sort of started to wind down a little bit, you start to see actually there's a little low level, or it's not low, but it's sort of like less spectacular level of
Mhm.
everyday ICE arrests and FBI incursions and things like this that just kind of fly under the radar most of the time. But once you have these networks in place, you kind of notice, oh, geez, well they're still
Mhm.
they're arresting people, and they probably have been doing this for
Yep.
years, but no one has been watching, and
Yep.
so that's something that these networks have kind of revealed, and it makes it even more difficult because a lot of those are more targeted and they're just looking for one person and then they leave. And so
Mhm.
having a response network there doesn't necessarily make a difference, but you do notice it. It does kind of appear on the radar in ways that it just hadn't in the past.
No, I think that, look, the documentation is extremely important because what we have seen from the organizing in Chicago and in Minneapolis is that when they were loud with the Gregory Belvino, the kind of like aggressive version of what they were doing these raids for, is that documentation was able to undermine the lies that were being told about our immigrant neighbors, which were the lies that they brought chaos and violence. And actually, the documentation, the work of the neighbors to neighbor organizing, was able to expose that who's bringing chaos and violence is ICE, and who's being picked up is the mothers and fathers in our communities, our neighbors, our families, our friends, our coworkers, our small business owners, right? That documentation about who and telling that story is critically important for understanding and moving other neighbors to say, actually, this is what's happening here. Because after that, after Minneapolis, what we have seen is that the policy is trying to avoid the accountability of our cell phone cameras, which is that
Yeah.
we have seen what we're calling like a shadow surge, which is that at scale in lots of different communities, they're trying to ramp up without talking about it publicly, grabbing folks early in the morning on their way to work in ways of just trying to grab folks here and there before neighbors can take a video of it. So they're moving in super quick to grab folks because they don't want to be caught on camera.
Right.
Because when they're caught on camera, right, then what we can see as neighbors, that this is what's happening, right? And so even if we, have the difficulty of having to watch our neighbor be picked up from us and are very limited in our ability to be able to do something about it, that documentation is actually really important about showing that to our, like, doing that in community organizing, telling that story about what's happening, because there are so many of us out here, in a vast majority that that do not want that for our communities in lots of different ways. And I think that kind of version is really important. The more that they are wanting to do this in the shadows, it is really critical that neighbors are helping to shine a light on that and pull it into public and say, this is happening and it's not right.
Yeah, I think we can tell. Is it just Memphis or Tennessee as a whole? They passed a law that says you can't record ICE agents any closer than like 25 feet or something like
In
this. So it's
25
clear that
feet.
they
Yeah.
understand that this is a restriction that they're
Mhm.
or a hindrance to their
And
work.
that just one got passed in Kansas as well too, right? Like we're seeing more of these being passed. And so I think like we can see this as evidence that the organizing, the documentation is working, right? That
Right.
like authoritarians fear accountability, right? Like the idea and the appeal of authoritarians is to avoid accountability and to think that that's an inevitability. And so our ability for regular people to organize neighbor to neighbor to force that level of accountability, even if it's not the sort of accountability that we want, that we need, like we need to build towards that. We need to build towards that accountability and demand that level of accountability. Because if whether it is the whether it is trying to do redistricting or create a restrictions on the ballot box, or whether it's trying to grab our neighbors, we need to show that there is accountability, that there is pushback to these authoritarian advances if we are going to stop those advances and then again demand a much more expansive democracy to create a system that actually works for working people.
So in Chicago and Minneapolis, as well as Los Angeles and Portland and some other cities, the state and local governments were also resisting, right? Or at least
Mhm.
they were in favor of the resistance. So what are the obstacles, as you think about these laws in Kansas or the laws and the task force in Memphis? What are the obstacles to mobilizing communities against initiatives like this when the state and local governments are not on board with the resistance and are actually helping with that repression?
Yeah, it can be it's definitely more challenging, right? But I think there can often be some local city council person or areas of which that there is areas to work with, right? So I
Right.
think like even if at the state level folks have been taken in by the authoritarian movement, are there local like forces? And part of what our trainings focus in on is helping folks build out these hyper local pieces that are working
Mhm.
in their communities. Because at the end of the day, the elected officials are accountable to the people in those communities. And if we can organize in a neighborhood by neighborhood, block by block, right, to create the conditions that say that, hey, that this community that puts you in office, like these are what, like, we want you to behave differently. That's going to take time. It's not instant, right? But that's part of the work. Like, I wish I could tell folks, like, here's a magic wand, or here is like a set of a paragraph of words that you can cast a spell and it's really easy and poof, we've got it. But that
Sure.
doesn't exist. Life is not that simple. And actually, it requires us to do this kind of work over time to build up that democracy muscle. I think for the last 40 to 50 years, like we haven't hit the democracy gym. Like we haven't been in there putting the reps in. Like some of our democracy muscles have atrophied because democracy isn't just elections. Actually, democracy is the kind of the day-to-day work we do in community to talk about what is happening in our community and how do we want it to make it different. And we need to put in that work, talking to our neighbors locally, rooted in place and purpose together, to think about how are we holding elected leaders, people making decisions in positions of power, accountable for these policies. And so, yes, in places where there are state and there are elected leaders, like it is a little bit different, right? Because they can be
Sure.
centers of gravity. But we also, in those places, we need to keep demanding that those elected leaders are creative, are expansive in their thinking about how they are standing up to an authoritarian's movements and how they are expanding democracy. Like nobody's got this entirely figured out. No state, no effort, right? And what we know is even in states that at the state level, that there are efforts and pushback, local movements in different parts of each and every state are advancing authoritarian efforts. And so I think, again, this is why it's important to do some of the hyper-local organizing in your community, because there are different folks who may be attacking the elections or passing 287G agreements or
Sure.
doing different efforts at the school board level where, you know, like take California, for example, right? We can think about that as like a big blue state with folks pushing back on authoritarian at the state level. But there are tons of localized efforts to attack at the school board level, to
Sure.
push anti-trans like efforts at the school level to ban books, right? There are lots of ways that which that the authoritarian movement shows up in our communities. And I think there's all different roles at different spaces for us to engage.
So, one of the upcoming trainings you're doing, I guess this is the one that's in person in St. Louis, but you talk a little bit about narrative and stories. Can you
Mhm.
say a little bit about how this fits into the strategy at States in the Core, and how do you go about training communities in that narrative work?
There is a lot of work that we can do organizing neighbor to neighbor of like butts and chairs, like moving together. Like as we think about like organizing, you think about like a protest or a march of like people showing up in a place. That stuff is really important. But we also need to be able to tell the story about what's happening. We talk about that as narrative work, or like how are we thinking about not only like what do we want, but how are we thinking about talking about a story about what is wrong, who broke it, and how to fix it,
Hmm.
and helping to tell that story. I think the authoritarian movement does this well. Their story is wrong and it is harmful and hurtful, but they have a story about uh, what's wrong, who broke it, and how to fix it. And that story often says that there's elites working with people in the bottom, squeezing folks in the middle, and that you should give up your rights and your freedoms so that authoritarians can protect you from that threat. It can protect you from, trans neighbors. That can protect you from immigrant neighbors. That if you give up your rights and freedoms, that we can protect you and keep you safe and give things for you. Right? That's a story. It's bullshit, but it's a convincing story to a lot of us. And I think we need to think about how are we sharing a different story about what is actually broken in our communities, who is responsible for that breakage, and how do we come together and fix it? Because we live in a complicated world where lots of different attacks are coming at us from different ways. And I think partly we need to think about how we think about what is the challenges that we face. I often talk about we have lots of shared anxieties. Like most Americans, to some degree, have varying levels of anxiety about like material stability or like the being able to like the rising costs, right? Like, to different degrees, right? We're all kept up at night about like
Right.
worrying about some kind of cost, right? Like, is that a car accident? Is that a cancer diagnosis? Is that a new baby on the way, right? Like, am I going to lose my job, right? Like, there are so many of us that don't have a ton of savings that like crises can cause real collapse in our families and our structures. We all feel those anxieties, and we all feel anxieties and want to live in safe communities and be safe in our home. And we all have anxieties about feeling like we're part of a community or something bigger than ourselves. And authoritarian movements prey on those anxieties and they agitate those anxieties, saying that it is your immigrant neighbors that are keeping you broke, that are keeping you feeling unsafe, and that are keeping you from feeling like a community. But we need to tell a different story, actually, that we together are how we make sure that we have good jobs, that we have access to good quality healthcare, that we together actually keep ourselves safe in our communities, and that we together are community, right? And like, I often feel this, right? And I work in different community defense groups and community formations, both nationally but then locally as well too. And you open up the paper or you just start doom scrolling, and all of a sudden you read, "World's on fire and it's getting hotter every day," right? Like that is like, it doesn't take long to read through, scroll through the news to feel overwhelmed by the threats that we have. And I think actually one of the most powerful feelings that I have and that I've heard others talk about is actually being in person in a room with neighbors who are there because they give a damn. And like, we
Yeah.
may not have all the answers, we may not be able to figure it out, and it may be a struggle. We may not be able to protect all of our neighbors. But getting together, eating together, building that community, talking about the concerns that we have, and working together on a complex set of problems about how do we get out of this. I think is actually really important in this moment, because the power of authoritarian movements, it says that we're a collection of strangers. And I think the power of democracy movements say that we're actually a collection of neighbors, that we know each other, we care about each other, and that we're in this together. And we can do that by building these community defense groups, kind of do some of this training about like, how do we actually get together and do some of that work to hold these authoritarians accountable in our communities.
Well, that's a very. I mean, I think you're bringing that hope. You're helping people kind of see that. You and States at the Core and other organizations like yours, you're helping kind of develop that muscle, build that capacity, and reveal the community that exists there.
Mhm.
And I think
Yeah.
you're hopeful, right? You talk about there's a tug of war, and we actually have a moment where we could win this tug of war.
Mhm.
Um,
Because we've done it before.
yeah.
Like, regular working Americans got together and overcame slavery. They overcame Jim Crow. They overcome other authoritarian pieces in our history. Like, we have done this before. It is hard. And like, it's gonna be hard. And we're not gonna get out of it overnight. But we've done this before and we can do it again. And that's what gives me hope, is that it is, if we put in the work, neighbor to neighbor, to do the hard thing, which is to talk to other people, to engage with our neighbors, to demand something that is better, that the redemption comes after reconstruction. Like, we have done this where we've expanded democracy, we've expanded citizenship, we've gotten ourselves closer to that American promise and ideal. We've never really reached the pinnacle of it yet, but we have done that. Regular people have done that work together. Not some kind of superhero from outside has done that, but average, everyday people who go to work every day, who put their shoulder to the wheel of history, has shown in this country we have done it and we can do it again. And we can actually have something better than the options that are before us if we do that work together.
Well, to that end, I see on the STAC calendar you have a training tonight
Mhm.
on election protection, and that's on Zoom. So anyone in the country could go to this. Are
Yep.
there still spaces in this training for folks to go to?
There are still spaces. We try to make it as accessible as possible. So we try to create big spaces for lots of folks to be there. But make sure you register for that training to get access to that one. And then we got another one on Friday as well, and that's going to be for Ice Watch, kind of like in this moment of what we're calling like the shadow surge. So as it's happening in different communities, we're seeing more ICE activity. How might you engage in ICE Watch? That's going to be this Friday. Also, Zoom open to anybody as well.
Well, so I'll put those links in the show notes for anyone who's interested in checking that out. Is there anything else that you'd want to plug or kind of tell people to follow or look at?
No, I think the last thing I would say is I think for folks who are new to doing this work or old hats doing this work, there is a moment of, I think, which with authoritarians require, like authoritarian movements in the mainstream require a level of courage. And that isn't just courage to go out and film ICE, but it is the courage to keep showing up. and keep showing up. After a boring community meeting that just doesn't really feel like you're making progress, is to come back and to keep showing up and actually to have the courage to keep on trying. And I think that's the courage that we need in this moment. And so just want to kind of end with the call to that kind of contagious courage that we need to keep on trying and to try together, even as this gets difficult and continues to be difficult.
Well, we'll take that advice to heart. Thanks for all the work you're doing and for taking the time to talk with us today. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
And thanks to everyone else who joined. Next week, we'll be speaking about artificial intelligence and warfare with Mike Hill, the author of Post-Human War, Brad Evans, who's a professor of political violence and aesthetics at the University of Bath, and Chantal Meza, an acclaimed Mexican painter based in the United Kingdom whose work practice focuses on the human as seen through various forms of disappearance. In order to accommodate their schedules, we'll be broadcasting on Thursday next week. If you're joining us on YouTube, it'll be streaming there again. And this episode will also be available on the Breaking Culture Live YouTube channel. So please share it with your colleagues or your friends who you might want to get into organizing. And let us know if you have any ideas for future episodes or invitees by emailing us at breakingculturelive@gmail.com. Thanks again for joining us. I'm Sean Johnson Andrews, and please check out my Substack at breakingculture.substack.com.